welcome to Gracefully Graying. I'm your host, Attorney Henry Gorenbein. Please watch our shows on the Gracefully Graying YouTube channel and visit and tell all your friends to visit and like our Gracefully Graying site. Today on Gracefully Graying, I'm pleased to welcome from Toronto, Canada, Dr. Andrea Wilkinson as we discuss her passion and project BrainShape. Andrea, welcome to Gracefully Graying.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
First of all, why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about who you are and your background?
Sure. So my name is Dr. Andrea Wilkinson, as Henry mentioned. I have a PhD in psychology with a specialization in cognitive aging. So what that means is I'm interested in understanding how our mental abilities, such as memory, change as we get older. So what that looks like, but also what can we do in our lifestyle to help sort of mitigate those natural, normal changes that occur in the brain.
Andrea, what prompted you to pick that as your area of specialization?
So that's a really interesting question. I have to decide what you want to do in undergrad when you are in high school still. So I think I was only 18 at the time that I was finishing high school. We still had grade 13, or what we called OAC. So I was 18 years old and deciding, the rest of your life, which is a pretty big, daunting task, I think. And so I really wanted to study psychology and understand the mind and how it worked. And my dad was giving me some great advice as per usual. And I got accepted into a university in Southern Ontario called McMaster University. And they had a great department called the gerontology department. It's changed names now, but it is a department that was dedicated to the study of aging. I think now it's called health and aging. And so my dad suggested, because I was going to McMaster and they had such a well-known gerontology department, that I also study gerontology. He said, you can study psychology. I know that's what you're passionate about, but consider adding something to your degree that will distinguish you from the masses, because so many people get a Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology. And so he said, take some gerontology classes, see how you like it. And if you enjoy it, then you can sort of take that on as a double major. And so I did my undergraduate degree and I double majored in psychology and gerontology, the study of aging.
And you've done research. What has some of your research show with regard to cognitive aging?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of research. When I was doing my master's and my PhD, I was specifically interested in understanding how brain games affected our mental abilities. And so at the time, so this is now 2007, 2009, brain games and sort of apps and all of those sort of technological interventions were all the rage. And so we were really interested in looking at how we could train a specific type of mental ability called inhibition, which is your ability to ignore distracting or irrelevant information. And so I was interested in training that ability using computer programs in the lab and looking at how improving that task, that mental function, could impact sort of generalized mental abilities. Because what we know is that if you are improving and training a specific mental function, so like I was talking about inhibition, the ability to ignore distracting information, it isn't just useful for you to get better at that specific task using what the game is on the computer. You have to be able to see sort of generalized effects. And so what I did was looking at training this ability and seeing if it could improve other areas such as memory and thinking speed. And so at the time, there was a lot of research being done on the use of these brain games to improve our mental functions. But what we know now is that brain games are really limited in their ability to improve overall general mental functions. You get better at the game you're playing, the specific task you're asked to do in the game. So if you're playing like word bubbles, for example. You get better at finding words in bubbles on a screen, but you don't get better at remembering your list of groceries at the grocery store, for example. And so we know now that brain games and these brain apps are really sort of narrow in terms of what they can improve in terms of your mental functions. You get better at the very specifics of the brain game, but they don't generalize outside of the computerized task or the app on your iPad, for example. And so to me, that means that it's a little bit futile, because if the goal is for us to improve our mental functions overall, then brain games are not that path to be able to do that effectively. And so as a PhD, the question then became, of course, well, if brain games don't work, then what can we do to maintain the health of our brain as we get older? And after I finished my PhD, a lot of research started coming out about the impact of lifestyle on the health of our brain. And so that was really where I started to shift my focus and my interest. And I founded BrainShape in 2014, which is when I got my PhD. I had successfully completed my PhD at that time. But I started BrainShape because I felt that there was a gap in information between what people were being told in the general public about what brain health meant and what the research was showing us about what brain health meant. Because all of the magazines and newspaper articles would invariably show the same list of 5 to 10 things that you need to do to improve your brain health. So they would always have a similar type of list. It was doing a crossword, reading a book, garden, learn to play an instrument, learn a new language. And it's not that those things are bad for your brain. It's just there is no finite list of things to do to keep your brain healthy. What I like to talk about is the pillars of brain health, and we'll talk about that a little bit in today's interview. But the 4 pillars of brain health, the lifestyle impacts that can help you maintain your brain function. And then when we talk about brain challenge and mental challenge, you have to really think about what it is that you are interested in, because learning to play guitar is not in and of itself going to improve your brain if you don't like to play guitar, you have no interest in playing guitar, and importantly, you're not going to pick the guitar up and play it regularly enough for it to change your brain. And so what I was seeing in the newspapers and magazine articles, the information that was getting out to the general public was a lot different from what I was seeing as an academic in the scholarly journals. And so I wanted to create a platform where I could share more of the research-based background around what it means to age in a healthy way and to keep your brain healthy.
You know, Andrea, I'm thinking of a key word that fits into everything: passion.
Yes.
It's like you need a passion for whatever you're doing. If you want to retire, you need a passion for retirement, or have things that are going to not just occupy the days that can be long, but something that you really care about. So let's jump into BrainShape. And first of all, start with the 4 pillars to support brain health that you mentioned earlier.
Yes. So the 4 pillars in general are physical fitness, food and nutrition is the second one, socializing is the third pillar, and then the 4th pillar is what I call mental considerations, but it includes sleeping well, managing your stress, and also that mental challenge or brain challenge component.
So let's start with the first pillar, and that is the importance of physical fitness. And what do you define by physical fitness?
Yeah, so physical fitness is interesting, and it's the pillar that I would say is the most important pillar if I were forced to pick one. So oftentimes I talk about the 4 key pillars, and I just mentioned them here. And someone will always say, you know, if I had to only do one, what should I do? Where should I put all my eggs in? Which basket should I put all my eggs in? And if I had to pick one, it would be physical fitness. And that's because it's sort of like this waterfall lifestyle factor that trickles down into all of the other domains, in my opinion. And so physical fitness is so important because it helps your body and your brain function well. So for example, we as humans grow around 700 new brain cells every single day. And research shows that when you exercise, you increase the number of brain cells that are growing in a specific part of your brain called the hippocampus, which is your memory center. But you can double or even triple the number of new brain cells that grow in your brain by virtue of exercising. And importantly, exercise increases the prevalence of a molecule called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And this brain-derived neurotrophic factor helps those new brain cells mature and survive. So that gives them a chance to actually connect up with an existing brain network. So by exercising, you're increasing the number of new brain cells that are growing specifically in your hippocampus, your memory center, and you're increasing the likelihood that those new brain cells will mature and survive and actually connect to an existing neural network. So exercise is so important to maintain the integrity of our brain, especially that memory center, which we know from research starts to shrink at a rate of around 1 to 2% per year after the age of 60. And those are normal age-related changes. Now, I just want to remind everyone that that is an average. So some people, it may shrink more than that, and some people, it may shrink less than that. So that's just an average if you look at all of the research. But we know that that memory center of our brain starts to shrink as we get older, and exercise is one of the ways that we can help maintain that memory center of our brain, keep it healthy and keep it active.
Andrea, are certain types of exercise better than others?
So that's a really important question. And I think that when talking about what it is that you need to do to stay physically active, I always default to telling my clients and members of my community that they need to figure out what works for them in terms of where their physical abilities are. Because it's not helpful, in my opinion, to say, oh, everyone needs to be doing, 30 minutes of weight training and this much aerobic exercise. What if someone has a mobility issue and they can barely even walk up and down the stairs very easily? So to me, that's not helpful because it discounts or it discourages people with a mobility issue away from exercising. And so it's about figuring out where it is that you are on your mobility journey and to identify some effective and realistic ways that you can move your body. So when I talk about exercise, I'm basically just talking about maintaining movement. So getting up and moving your body in any way that is appropriate for you. And for some people, that means just walking around the grocery store, for example. So I had a past client who has difficulty walking, and they weren't yet in the mental space where they were comfortable getting a mobility aid, such as a walker, but walking was really hard for them. So they couldn't sort of go on a half an hour walk effortlessly. But they figured out that if they were in the grocery store with a cart in front of them, they could walk for longer. And so that person started to implement longer walks in the grocery store because that was a way that they could move their body that was realistic for them. And for some people, it may just be using the bathroom in the basement. So they have to use the stairs when they go to the bathroom, however many times a day. But it's just about being acutely aware of the movement that you're including in your everyday life and including it in a way that is intentional because we want to keep our bodies active. And there's some research that shows that even just walking, so simple walking, which people don't often think about when they think about exercise, but walking has been linked to maintaining white matter integrity in the brains of older adults. And white matter is the part of our brain that's responsible for the speed at which information gets passed from one area of the brain to another. So even just walking is such a great way to move your body. And my recommendation is to just include 30 minutes of movement every single day.
Andrea, let's move to the second pillar, which is diet and nutrition. Tell us about that and how that fits into your 4 pillars.
So diet and nutrition is really important because we can think about food as being fuel for our brains and our bodies. And what we're starting to learn a lot more about now is the importance of the health of our gut to the health of our brain and our overall health. So there's a nerve called the vagus nerve that connects your gut not only to your brain, but it also connects to very important vital organs such as your liver and your spleen and your kidneys and your lungs and your heart. And so keeping your gut healthy impacts the health of your brain and all of the different parts of your body as well. And we also know that around 90% of the serotonin in our bodies, and that is sort of our happy, quote unquote, signaling molecule. But that serotonin is produced primarily in our gut. And so the foods that we eat create the building blocks for that happy signaling molecule. And so it's so important that we think about our food that we're consuming as creating these important molecules in our bodies that help us feel good. And we know that that serotonin, which is the happy signaling molecule, there's research that shows that what you eat directly impacts the prevalence and the presence of depressive symptomology in individuals. And so there's research that shows the importance of what you eat, not only to the health of your body, but also to your sort of how your emotional well-being as well. And when I talk about food and nutrition, I also like to mention sugar metabolism. So a lot of what we eat gets converted into sugar or glucose that our cells use as energy. And you can think about sort of your body effectively using the sugar in your bloodstream. But if there's too much sugar based on what you're eating, your body has a hard time metabolizing it and utilizing it effectively. And when you have too much sugar in your bloodstream, it not only damages the blood vessels in your body, but it also damages the tiny blood vessels in your brain. So it's really important for us to think about the sugar quantities in the food that we're eating, but not just sugar itself, also the quality of the foods that we're eating. So if we're eating processed foods, for example, so anything that's pre-packaged, pre-made, it's often loaded up with chemicals and added sugar and added salt. And so we really want to remove those pre-processed foods from our diet so that our bodies can be effective at metabolizing the sugar in our bloodstream and utilizing it effectively by our brains and our bodies.
There's certain diets. I mean, I'm thinking as you're speaking, Andrea, about the Mediterranean diet, which recommends, more seafood, a lot of vegetables, grains, nuts, by way of example. And again, less in the way of starchy foods, breads, and things that do convert to glucose and sugar.
Yes. So the Mediterranean diet is definitely sort of my overarching recommendation when people ask for a framework to use, because as you just outlined, it really sort of hits all of the check marks in terms of what we should be thinking about when we are eating a healthy diet. And in the Mediterranean diet, they also talk about minimizing the consumption of these pre-processed, pre-packaged foods, as well as sweets and desserts. So really sort of cutting those out of your diet as well. And so what I like to talk about too is for people to not only think about narrowly what types of foods they should be eating. So people think about omega-3s, they're really good for your brain health. But you can't just eat a whole bunch of omega-3s and eat lots of salmon, fatty fish, for example, because it's good for your brain. That's true, but you also have to diversify. So thinking about a globally healthy diet, an overarching healthy approach to how we are consuming our food and how we're nourishing our brains and our bodies, I think is really important.
Andrea, let's go to the third pillar, and that is, I believe, socialization. And tell us about the importance of that.
Yeah, so socialization is essential. So as humans, we are built to function well and to survive in community. So we are pre-programmed to want community, to socialize. We're social beings. And so that is an essential part of our well-being, is being in community and socializing. But you can also think about socializing as a very complex mental activity. So I have to, if you and I are talking right now, I have to listen to the words that are coming out of your mouth, make sense of them, hold them in my mind while I develop my response using the information that I have in my own mind. And so pulling all of those pieces together is a really dynamic, complex mental activity. activity. So socializing is important for our sense of well-being and sense of security, but it's also an important mental challenge and engaging mental activity.
How has the pandemic impacted upon this pillar from your perspective?
Well, I think that the pandemic has impacted how we socialize in a very profound way. I'm sure anyone that's listening to this will feel that that resonates with them. For a lot of us, we are, physically distancing from our friends and our families. And so we're forced to socialize in a different way than we have previously. And that's really uncomfortable for us because, as I mentioned, as humans, we are pre-programmed to want to exist in community. It's tied to our survival mechanism. And so it is definitely an adjustment for us as humans. And I think that we need to be really in tune with ourselves about what our social requirements are, because it's a very individualized need. It's not just a blanket like, oh, everyone should get on 2 Zoom calls a week and that's going to make everyone feel good, because that's not true. We have to think about us as individuals. What do we need to help us feel socially connected in meaningful ways to the people around us? And so we have to get really brutally honest with ourselves about what is lacking in our lives right now in this particular moment in human history, and what we can do to help bridge the gap in a safe way.
What are some key mental considerations to support brain health from your perspective, Andrea?
So the key mental considerations, so that's the 4th pillar. And I talk
Okay.
about these mental considerations being stress management, sleeping well, and then also those mental challenges. And so we can think about stress management as us as humans. We evolved this stress response, but the stress response was really meant to keep us alive when we're facing a life-threatening situation. And so if you can think back, hundreds of thousands of years ago, if you saw a mountain lion off in the distance, you would mount a stress response and your heart would start beating faster and your breathing would get sort of sped up and it would become really shallow, and glucose would get sent out into your bloodstream. And all of this was happening in your body to help you survive, to help you either fight or flee this mountain lion that you saw in the distance. The difference is that we were meant to have our stress response mount in short amounts of time. So we were not built to be chronically stressed out. But if you think about today's society, of course, now in the global pandemic, we are constantly stressed out. But even before the pandemic hit, humanity, we were sort of just biased and prone to being a stressed out species. We would get stressed out being in the line at the grocery store. We would get stressed out, reading emails or thinking about deadlines. And so we have to take a step back and realize that when we feel stress in our bodies, there's a lot of physiological changes that are taking place. And those changes were not meant to be sustained in a constant, chronic way. And so we have to take the steps to minimize and manage our stress response, identifying what it is in our lives that is creating our stress response, that's making us feel overwhelmed, but also using techniques and strategies that can help reduce your feelings of stress in your body. So, for example, my favorite stress management technique is deep breathing. So if you breathe out for twice as long as you breathe in. So if you breathe in for a count of 4 and exhale for a count of 8, for example, you are going to calm down your nervous system and stimulate your vagus nerve, which activates your parasympathetic nervous system. And that's the side of your nervous system that's responsible for rest and digest and recovery. And so by doing that deep breathing, you can actually stimulate your parasympathetic nervous system and create that sense of calm in your body. And so it's really important for us to be proactive about managing our own stress in our lives.
Especially during these crazy times. Andrea, what is living phase 2?
So before I get to living phase 2, I just want to
Okay.
mention in the mental considerations, the sleep as well as the mental challenges. So I talked about stress. Sleep is really important for our brain health because during sleep, these special cells called glial cells get turned on and actually wash your brain out. So it washes away toxins and some plaques that build up in your brain. And so when we're not sleeping properly or not sleeping for long enough so that we can get into that deep stage of sleep, we're not actually getting that cleaning phase to take place. And so when you wake up after not sleeping very well and you feel really groggy and you have mental fog and really unclear, it's all of those toxins and beta amyloid plaques that are building up in your brain. And so getting good quality sleep is so essential for brain health. And of course, it's not easy, right? If I say, everyone knows sleeping well is good for your brain, but if you're not sleeping, it feels a little helpless. But I want to remind your listeners that there are strategies and techniques that you can use to help improve the quality of your sleep if you sort of start to integrate those techniques in a sustainable pattern. And so good quality sleep is so important. And then that piece around the mental challenges, we touched on it a little bit earlier, but really thinking about how to challenge your brain in a way that is meaningful for you. And as you said, Henry, that you're passionate about. And so thinking about brain challenges as being a very unique area. So what challenges my brain specifically is different than what's going to challenge your brain, Henry. And so we have to think about, what do I like to do? What are my skill sets? And how can I build my brain challenge around what I already know to be true, but that also stretches me a little bit and gets me a little bit uncomfortable. And that's going to be this moving target, because what challenges my brain today is different from what challenged my brain a year ago. And so it's this ever evolving dynamic process. So I just wanted to touch on those two other pieces of the mental considerations before we moved on to phase 2.
Tell us about phase 2, then I really want to jump into your podcast series, which to me is really so important.
All right. So phase 2 is just about living in what I call a second phase of life. So any sort of transition that has taken place so for some people it's retiring, for some people it's empty nesting. It's just coming into a new sort of dimension, a new form of your existing life. Some change has taken place, and it is a great opportunity because we're transitioning into a new phase. It's a great opportunity for us to sort of take stock of where we are and how it is that we want to show up differently in this new phase of life that we are entering. And so it's a really great opportunity to sort of take a step back and to become a critical sort of analyzer of our own lives and what new ways we want to show up in this next phase.
Tell us about what prompted you to do your podcast series, which, by the way, Lori and I have been listening to them, and they're wonderful.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to have some of the BrainShape podcast episodes featured on the Gracefully Graying site. But I started the podcast really as a way to connect with my community on a regular basis about brain health information and aging well. So what does that mean? And how can you begin to implement those strategies into your life in a meaningful way? And so the way that I sort of structured the podcast is to invite on experts in various fields of interest. And so they get to share their expertise in a way that is easy to understand, so that the community and my listeners can really take those tips and tools and implement them in their everyday life. So we cover so many different topics on the podcast. At the time of this recording, there are currently 94 episodes of the BrainShape podcast that are out and available to listen to. We've talked about mindfulness and meditation. We've talked about stress in the brain. We've talked about music in the brain, cognitive aging, caregiving, social isolation, creativity, for example, and how time off is an essential component of a creative pursuit. So we've covered so many different topics, and I've interviewed some really excellent guests.
Andrea, where can people find these topics? I mean, more and more of them are going to be on our site, Gracefully Graying, but what about your site?
Yeah. So if people want to listen through the website, it's BrainShape.ca/podcast. So all of the episodes are there and they're ready to be listened to. Or you can search on your favorite podcast platform, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify, for example, and search the BrainShape podcast. So BrainShape is actually one word, podcast, and then you'll find the show, and you can listen to all the episodes on your favorite podcast platform as well.
We're out of time. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Andrea Wilkinson, for being our guest on Gracefully Graying today. It's been a wonderful conversation, and we just scratched the surface. I want to thank you for being our guest, and I want to thank our viewers for watching Gracefully Graying. And please watch this wonderful show with Dr. Andrea Wilkinson and all of our other shows at the Gracefully Graying YouTube channel, and also like and visit our site, gracefullygraying.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.